So let's talk about different groups and who had the most motivations to release COVID-19 on purpose, how they benefited, and you can decide for yourself who had the most reasons, the most probable reasons, and the best reasons. I'm Josh. Welcome to Buried Values. We're going to talk about some values, and this is going to get pretty real.
Stand or fall, but stand for something. Stand for the truth, because the truth has value. Class is just an act.
If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more videos like it. Now let's get started in finding the truth. So we're going to look at all the reasons why COVID-19 happened. Let's take that mask off. So I've made a chart that we're going to follow along and keep score to see whether it was the Russians, the Chinese, the Democrats, or the Republicans. And we're also going to look at Big Pharma, Big Oil, and organized crime and see who benefited, when, and how, and who lost. So the idea is to look at whether this was a plandemic, who got the benefits to motivate them enough to release COVID. And we're going to keep score. We're going to look at whether it was the Republicans and the Trumps, or the liberals and the Pelosi's and Clintons, the Russians and Putin, Chinese and Xi, or the big oil companies, the drug cartels, or Big Pharma. They all have characters represented in the buried values, the infection. And I wanted to really look at this to see what was going on. So we're going to keep score. And by the way, the drug cartels are going to be also referring to organized crime. So here's our scorecard, and let's go. First off, a lot of people I've heard say this was about population control. I don't know if you'll subscribe to that theory or not, but we're going to put it down there and give everybody a point for it that could benefit from controlling their populations that they're responsible for. Obviously, if big oil or drug cartels or big pharma saw an increase in the population, they'd see an increase in customers. So what the hell would they care? Now, what about resetting all of the financial sector? If we erase the debt by bankrupting all these countries that have to put out stimulus funds and keep their populations in check, or even fund purchases so big oil can keep having sales, the drug cartels can still have customers, and Big Pharma can obviously sell the vaccines and get the government to purchase them from companies like Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and so forth. And don't forget that it's AstraZeneca and other countries, and they all have their brands. But that opens it up to hacking, because a lot of people went off the cash accounts and were urging people to go into cryptocurrency. They were making up businesses to employ themselves at home if they couldn't go to work in like the restaurant and hospitality industries to deal with cryptocurrency. And then you could make or break it and lose a lot of money really fast. And that was going on. Now, there's a lot of issues about racial homogeneity. Obviously, the KKK and the neo-Nazis marched in support of Trump. They came out and benefit anti-immigration groups and were very xenophobic. And you saw that actually in Russia, I think. I don't know so much about the Russian population, but definitely with the Chinese. A fact that most of the Chinese are Chinese is pretty undisputed. But the Uyghurs and other people from different faiths and from different outlying regions of China were discriminated against greatly. Major human rights violations. And of course, this is under the Chinese just because I put it there, but it's really about America. The 2020 census was required as by law, and usually identifying features were coming up in medical records, and people were encouraged a lot to do 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and they could generally trace your genealogy and decide who was desirable and who was not. Reminds you of Nazi Germany and selective eugenics. I don't trust those companies, and I don't trust the motivations. I don't like to give personal information. I'm not sure about you guys, but there was a lot of thought put into whether or not this was being collected on purpose for nefarious reasons. The sick and the dead could be collected for human testing and engineering fear by creating more viruses and doing more harm. So we had this going on, and of course, I'm not sure where all the bodies in the refrigerator cars in New York came from, whether it was the nursing homes, indigents, or the real big death tolls that were supposedly experienced in Italy were going on. But there could be race-based infections and care rationing. Certainly American black people remember the times when they were tested and experimented on, especially in prisons, and they resisted, or at least large amounts of their population did, to getting the vaccine. And that's one reason why a lot of people were afraid of getting vaccinated, just in that particular group. Finally, there was a lot of the same reasons motivating anti-abortion causes. For at home in America, it's a lot about our own population growth and replacing our own population with Americans, not immigrants. And the Democrats did not take that stance, so I didn't give the liberals points for this, going towards the pandemic. Russians certainly want to encourage the growth. The Chinese were overpopulated. And again, big oil, illegal drug markets, and big pharma all benefit by having more people buying more product. They'd all have reasons to be anti-abortion. I don't think people are sincerely dedicated to their religions or their beliefs. Some are, I mean, sure, but you have a lot of this going on, this other motivation. So let's take a look at the score, and wow, we come up, I was doing this and I didn't know how this was going to turn out, but the conservatives, especially like the Trumpers, are leading for the reasons about why they might release the pandemic on purpose. Now we go into the drug cartels, and I just wanted to look at what organized crime could do with this. Spending on the homeless and keeping cash in their hands was a way to keep drugs going and keep the illegal drug markets flowing. They're not living off the grid. If you're going to just drop out of society and go smoke weed, you're really not living off the grid. You'll see how this draws you back in to participate. So they close the recycling, and it makes people more dependent. But the Democrats then issuing transfer payments and unemployment checks and welfare and also disability, they all were able to grow their constituency because people were able to or make sure they were coming in to vote for that. But you know what? Guess what? The Republicans needed people to pay their property. They had to collect rents, and a lot of people were motivated to do so because they were afraid of becoming homeless. The Democrats later had a solution for that, and I give them points for it later, like moratoriums on evictions and that sort of thing. But this was going on. And I stated that people needed paper money to avoid the insecurities of cryptocurrency. Certainly the governments, whether ran by conservatives or liberals in various states and federal offices, wanted to avoid it. The drug cartels definitely needed cash for untraceable transactions and collecting their money for dime bags and that nut. Meanwhile, Wall Street was benefiting totally because the big business was preferred and squeezed out small business, and a lot of people were hurting. And it didn't benefit independent organized crime. But it did benefit the governments that were trying to bring in home production and return jobs back to their native countries, especially the United States. But Russia possibly too. Nothing is really made on the international market in Russia, but a lot of American jobs were shipped overseas, and so much is made in China that having home-produced goods benefited both Republicans and Democrats if they can restore jobs to the United States. So let's take a look at the score right now, and you can see that actually The score is moving between Democrats and Chinese relatively even, and between Republicans and Russians, it's pretty close, but we're going to see outliers break away later. But these scores are going to be kind of tied together between the party and their foreign interference. But they're outnumbering the reasons for big oil, drug cartels, and big pharma. But we'll go back and consider whether they were good reasons that the coronavirus would be released on purpose to benefit them. So let's take a look at the political benefits in the countries. There's less time for protests, and we'll get into reasons why different groups were protesting and organizing. If people are scared about becoming homeless and working, or having no other options but being out there protesting and occupying areas to disrupt commerce and possibly spread the virus. But some of the protests were about erasing U.S. history. You had people trying to cancel statues and take down Confederate flags and rewrite history. And there was a lot of that going on also about people's freedom of speech and what the right was being able to say and who was being canceled off Facebook and Twitter and whatnot. The Russians and the Chinese benefit by erasing our cultural history. Now, guess what? The Republicans were doing the same thing. They're all guilty. You know about them being anti-1619 Project, which is just teaching our history and the truth. This is not wokeism, this is history. In the opening page of Buried Values Library, I have a quote from archaeology professor Darren Hughes, who said the United States was founded on mercantilism and slavery. It was a colonial free market area for people that wanted a chance to come over here and better themselves or have any chance at all against the established markets and bourgeoisie that were grounded in Europe. So we had the American colonies, and they eventually fought the revolution to break away from taxation and exploitation. But we don't want to bury the truth. The 1619 Project, as far as I'm understanding, is only history. But let's go on. So I'm just making the point that the conservatives were erasing history too. Now, all sides wanted to accept martial law and control their populations, and they could especially make themselves look good by serving law and order and controlling the protests and keeping the peace and making people afraid that they need their governments to do that. The Chinese and Russians are experts at this, but both Democrats were accused of it with social distancing and face masks and mandatory indoor dining closures and things like that. And the Republicans wanted to do this by establishing lockdowns against protests and containing them by the police forces and a lot of the private security forces and assembled federal workers that were brought in, like Border Patrol, marshal's offices, and prison guards, and whoever could be mobilized if Trump couldn't use the United States military on our own streets. What was interesting, too, was this accelerated gun ownership because of the need to arm Ukraine and sell guns abroad for other conflicts. They knew were coming. They had to know. The Russians sold guns. They sold it to the cartels. They needed guns to defend their territories. And the lockdowns created more competitions for more drug territories. Conservatives long support the gun industry, or the gun industry supports their PACs, and accelerating the gun sales was definitely a motivation. And then, of course, they wanted to control the education about all this. What do we have to think about our values? Well, I mean, the conservatives advanced ideas that parents and family had to support certain social agendas to keep out other social agendas, which the liberals were espousing. You got the Don't Say Gay laws, the critical race theory, and religion in schools, all the usual suspects, actually. It's not new. And then, of course, the Russians and the Chinese control the education of their young, and big oil and big pharma can benefit from that as well. For big oil and big pharma, commercials for their products and ads against alternative energies and pro-oil companies are definitely of benefit, so that can be inserted in the education of young people so they don't believe in alternative energy and they do believe in vaccines and pharmaceutical products marketed by the big companies like Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. Now, at the same time, we see a lot of groups cooperating with each other are gaining benefits together. The Republicans and the Russians are closely tied, and the Democrats and the Chinese are closely tied. Ultimately, somebody's going to break away and have the highest score. So let's take a look at why the Russians might have released the coronavirus in China using SVR agents to operate inside the Wuhan labs. Russia's biggest export are the fossil fuels that propel its country and its oligarchs to having any stability or control. But they're drilling in the Arctic, but they need to ship out, of course, through the Black Sea and into the Aegean Sea and out the Mediterranean to get out to the larger world. And they don't have shipping ports where they can reach that part of the world if they don't take over more positions in Ukraine. So we're going to see how that plays into Putin's plans. The fossil fuel exports benefit the fossil fuel companies and OPEC, of course. But we're going into that and we're checking who else benefits. And investors. So conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans, and then even the hackers that are going into the electronic distribution of funds from all the big oil companies, including their stocks traded in Russian markets as well as the Chinese. They all benefit. I can only see a part where Big Pharma has no benefits or gains here. But these other people will buy the stocks low when people aren't driving and the stock market crashes. And then once people are back and things are back opened again, the demand for fuel goes up. They've bought low and now their investments are worth a heck of a lot. The lower supply doesn't agree with the drug cartels. But if they steal the oil, they can use it for transporting their drug products. And at the same time, they can save any surplus, which they can resell later, especially if the price is expected to go higher once people start driving. The Russians were banking on this too, because they had a lot of oil reserve, and that was their main product. The Russians invented the term kompromat. They will use sexual blackmail to control politicians and policies around the world. They send their agents in, and they get the evidence out. You can see this in the flip-flopping and control over Republican agents who are operating, lawmakers. But the Democrats fell prey to that too, and some of it from China. There was a scandal with Eric Swalwell. The Chinese influenced the Democrat senator from Fang Fang, who was also known as Christine Fang, a Chinese agent that was close to the senator and having some type of affair to do with him. So this was not just the conservatives, but policy did tend to revolve around them while they were in control of Congress and the White House. Now, as we continue to look at Russia's benefiting from releasing the coronavirus intentionally, Putin is gaining revenge for bankrupting the Soviet Union. Russia has suffered since after World War II in its competition with capitalists and trying to spread communism around the world. And I would say that the Trumpsters that went along with the Russian kompromat gained power and are trying to retain power by submitting to this program. But Putin really wants revenge, especially for the fall of the Soviet Union when Russia had an empire controlled by Moscow, and Reagan helped to bankrupt it in the 80s. Putin was the director of the KGB, which has been replaced, of course, now by the SVR, where you'll see SVR agents operating in my novel, The Infection. And he fancies rebuilding a Russian empire to be like a czar. I suggested that maybe he even believes that he's a descendant of the Romanovs, the last dynasty to rule Russia, but they were taken out by the communists and in the revolution executed except there's always been rumors that one of the daughters survived, and I played to that with the Naomi Starr character and her ancestry. But when we look at what happened in Russia, we have to take in consideration that in other countries, especially like it started in Italy and then it spread to the United States, healthcare workers were celebrated by banging pots and pans and blowing horns or playing music and singing songs every day at 5 o'clock. And this really didn't go on in Russia that I know of. Instead, what happened was there were 3 doctors that were killed. They fell out of windows. Yeah, that actually happened. Look that up. And one was a mother with a couple of children. They either had information about the coronavirus they didn't want to be shared, or they got into trouble for refusing to work like 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts, as medical workers were way overtaxed and stressed out with all the stuff they had to do during this pandemic. So we have to ask, is that what really happened? Russia stole the vaccine, presumably. They were offering bounties to third parties who killed Americans in Afghanistan, and they were just a corrupt player altogether. So I wouldn't put it past them. And look at what's going on in Ukraine now. We can see this could have been an objective of them and a very complicated plan spread out through the long term. Putin certainly knows how to do that as a former director of KGB and running the country now with their SVR. So they all benefited from the travel industry, and they had temporary payoffs and stimulus packages so they could keep employment and protection going for countries everywhere where hospitality businesses were shut down. Now, I gave points to both the liberals and conservatives, as Democrats and Republicans all had investments in the airlines and they wanted to keep jobs in their districts, and airport employees that are highly trained, employed, and ready to come back when businesses recovered. Big oil benefited, of course, because they were going to have stocks in those companies that they did business with. And the airlines and the cruise ships probably double dipped. I mean, why wouldn't they? They're private people that can own stock in business, and they work in the industry that benefits from it. So we move on. So what about the Chinese? Well, they had a huge manufacturing advantage, so they needed to ship their products everywhere, but ports were closing. But we still had to realize that, shipping the fentanyl and the drugs that go through help offset their costs of shipping. And that comes up with their fentanyl. And there's so much of an opioid epidemic in the United States. This was really affecting people. The shutdown, this actually could have caused great gains for both Republicans and Democrats who wanted to close off fentanyl and cut down our opioid problems, which would increase employment at home because people can't pass drug tests if they're high. But you could blame the triad. The Chinese could say, oh, it's not our fault, the Communist Party, that is. They could blame, Liang Tran and the Chinese Tongs that comprise the triad and their underground criminal culture, whereas they are still able to operate in a totalitarian police state. Go figure how. Of course, with help. And not only that, when the Chinese invested, they borrowed Arab money, mostly from Qatar, for the Russian oil deal. And there was the Clean Energy Finance Fund, which was something that Hunter Biden was involved with also. So you can look at that and say, well, the Chinese benefited from all this. Now, as we continue, Chinese stopped Indian agents that might have had evidence or something in a contested province between China and India's borders. And my character An is supposedly having a brother killed there who was fighting possibly as another agent of the Xia, but maybe mainly in the Chinese military. Could be pronounced Chia, too, in Chinese, but it's spelled Xia. So, now we go again to more Chinese reasons in America. If they wanted to control things in American politics, the anti-Chinese activism that happened, attacks on Chinese American citizens, look this up, it actually occurred. They could incite the Proud Boys and nativists, anti-immigrants to be anti-Chinese and benefit off of that so as to create sympathy and reopen our ports and try not to have racist anti-Chinese policies, as they could spin that. But the Democrats would win votes there by citing Trump enabling anti-Chinese racism. Remember, he even had China virus written on his speech notes, and they made a big deal about showing that in the news. Well, I don't think stuff happens by accident. Meanwhile, of course, the drug cartels selling their products, it benefits them, of course. And drug trafficking is big in the Western Hemisphere, where it's easier to pay people off. You don't really want to get caught doing that in China without actually having support of the Chinese Communist Party, which I talked about earlier might be the case. So here's the score. And again, the Chinese are gaining support of the Democrats, and they supported the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, ahead of time. And the people on both sides opposing it happened to be Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Interesting. And on page 375 of my novel, I assert that there should be a plane crash. And I need to find out who was on that flight. It actually happened, about 2 years and a couple of months after I was writing the story. But it did happen, and the Democrats gained funding, of course, through their Chinese connections, who probably have made contributions to the campaigns. The United States has meddled in other countries' politics. Of course, it happens here. So we come to, what about the Democrats? Now we take an in-depth look as to whether the Democrats benefited by releasing coronavirus. Look at what they got in the deal. They got universal testing, a universal vaccine eventually, which Big Pharma benefited from, though. And Biden saw historic records of distribution and accomplished that, getting everybody out the vaccine. But Trump actually initiated Operation Warp Speed to get it done and get it out there. The research on mRNA vaccinations and also on the coronavirus started in the 80s. Basically, it was deemed appropriate to be prepared for the worst case scenarios. And people were studying how bad viruses could get. And the other option would be having done nothing. Though the World Health Organization is lambasted, this possibly made the coronavirus release available as a method to accomplish these things on these different groups' wish lists. But I think to not be prepared and not study it in the event of an actual virus release would have been stupid. Post if you disagree. But the Chinese were ready. They had protective masks manufactured already, and it was easy for them to continue their trade. If they had to ship them over here, they could continue sending opioids. Now we have to keep up with big oil, because big oil was the method to ship it over here. So, of course, we ask whether the Democrats did this to get rid of Donald Trump. When you collapse an economy with the lockdowns, it creates the pressure to have another party elected. This always works this way, and people vote in presidential elections. But the Republicans could get rid of Democratic governors like Cuomo and Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer, amongst others, because of the lockdown policies. They knew that Democrats would follow the science and try to contain this as best they could. You got to make decisions how to keep your hospitals open for your public, because people get into car accidents and they have broken arms and just standard heart issues and cancer issues that need to be taken care of now. And it's normalized to have spaces available in hospitals, and you can't have a pandemic. A political leader has to make choices. These were the choices they figured the Democrats would make. And Republicans benefited by that because they could have anti-lockdown protests. But the Democrats hurt organized crime by hurting Main Street versus Wall Street, where they were all invested. However, look at this. Everybody except organized crime basically made gains. We covered that before. I gave them all points again, except for organized crime, because Main Street suffered. But the liberals got universal health care, paid sick leave, moratoriums on evictions, rent loan deferrals, so house the homeless, and the other policies made sure that people didn't become homeless because we have enough as it was. But the cartel's customers weren't going to become homeless, And Bernie Sanders could even spread this affection to get it going, which might have even been when he dropped out. It was very interesting how after Clyburn comes in South Carolina, Bernie, who was beating Joe Biden, suddenly stops his mass rallies and suddenly suffers losses in the polls, and Biden takes the lead. Bernie was much more charismatic and had a much greater following for true liberals than Biden ever did. But that was spreading the virus by having rallies. Trump continued, of course, but we'll get to that. But the drug cartels benefit because their customers could get universal health care, paid sick leave, moratoriums on evictions, and rent loan deferrals, all this so they could spend more money on drugs. Big Pharma benefited, of course, because they had more money to spend on Big Pharma and get the medicines going. There you go. So, wow, look at all these things that came off the Democrats' wish list. They worked in collusion with these other groups, possibly. The Chinese are racking up wins, but so are the Republicans and Russia. Even big oil and big pharma is being left behind. We can look at who had the most reasons and who had the best reasons, and I'll let you decide. But we are looking at all the reasons why COVID-19 happened. So now we're going to take a look at how the Republicans might have benefited from releasing the coronavirus on purpose. Now look at this. American Democrats, liberals, have taken the lead for having the most reasons to spread the coronavirus. This would be done by CIA operatives in Wuhan, China, and the World Health Organization. Now, we're going to look at the Republicans. Remember again that whoever has the most reasons doesn't necessarily have the best reasons. We can't prove anything yet, so let's go on when counting the reasons and then seeing in a review who might have had the best. And that's highly subjective or opinionated. But the Democrats would certainly lose elections because of lockdowns and people protesting having their businesses closed or being unable to operate or find employees for hospitality businesses, dining and travel, whatnot. So the Republicans would get rid of Democrat governors like Gretchen Whitmer, or they could attempt it, Cuomo, obviously, and also Gavin Newsom in California, because the lockdowns were going to be protested against. They also brought out the right to work rally, and people who had their businesses impacted by the closures and social distancing, indoor dining restrictions, and a lot of their lower income voters went out to protest because their jobs were shut down or they were getting less hours because places had been closed by the pandemic. And this made a group of potentially angry citizens who were able to be transported to Washington for the January 6th rally. And they had organized and experienced protesting by that point. Now, it creates a lot of mistrust of science and the educated this way, and just caters to the religious right, as they all looked for something to believe in, as they were fed fake news and basically the propaganda that the mainstream media was presenting it as fake news. This was a Russian tactic and even employed by Goebbels, who was the prime propaganda chief for Adolf Hitler. It's nothing new. So discrediting Dr. Fauci was very important. They couldn't just get rid of Dr. Fauci because he'd served Republicans and Democratic presidents for a long time in his position with the infectious diseases. And what happened there was in Russia and in China, they could just kill off their scientists or doctors that didn't toe the line, and they did. But Fauci, he's still with us, and he's still going. So like him or not like him, this didn't exactly work, but it was part of the plan. So they did end up being able to cut the funding to the World Health Organization, though. The World Health Organization had originally been doing the research in the United States before it was moved to China, and dates back to even the 80s when mNRA was first researched and gain of functions to tell if a virus that got out of control could be contained and vaccinated against. It was smart to study the worst case scenario, but Republicans didn't seem to think so. And they wanted people to be afraid of gain of function research and therefore discredit it. As we continue here looking at the Republicans' reasons or the conservatives' reasons for perpetuating the coronavirus, we end up looking at some Democratic points. Having a counterpoint to the right to work rallies and respecting science and respecting the educated was a liberal talking point. And if they didn't, and in their churches and at Trump rallies they super spread, they did get rid of some of the religious right and the conservative coalitions. I mean, you know, they got sick at their own peril. But the Russians were managing to create a citizen army that destabilized the United States on both sides, because, of course, the left had Antifa and Black Lives Matter was mobilized. So let's take a look at the scores now. Republicans are catching up, and they saved states' rights, and they tied that to culture war issues, and moreover, increasing the birth rate. But a lot of the social issues, including like the don't say gay problems they're having now with laws in different conservative states, were tied to that to make sure that we replaced our population, because they want the birth rate to continue, especially amongst low income and blue collar families. Well, that increases the Social Security solvency, right? Except Democrats want that too. Older folks get more conservative because they're afraid of being on fixed income and retiring and not having anything to count on if everything's taxed and inflation offsets them. So there's a tendency for younger people to be liberal and older people to be conservative and that sort of thing. Let's continue. They're going to get the wall built, which was a Trump priority, and do that maybe by getting the Mexicans to stop Americans from medical tourism, as they're not going to fund, with higher taxes, health care and universal programs to lower our costs and prevent bankruptcies from medical emergencies. In the meanwhile, that's great news for big oil and drug cartels and big pharma anyway, because of the increased birth rate. They're going to continue to have customers. We had that covered. They got points for that before, but I gave the Republicans points again, so I'm giving big oil and cartels and big pharma their point too. And the Russians always want to increase their birth rate because they haven't replaced their population. The Chinese are overpopulated. So the Republicans create fake news. It's straight out of Goebbels' playbook, and this really much affected how people are viewing the information they get, as now people are subscribing to small groups like the Fire Stick and Roku, and only paying for the news that they want to hear and not getting a balanced perspective. So the liberals launched a giant media campaign. China is helping to pay for that, and it increases their shipping profits because commercials pay for television, and the commercials are for products that basically are made in China, and people are shipping through Amazon. And Big Pharma advertises everything, including the conservatives helping them advertise hydroxychloroquine, which Trump backed, and he was actually invested in. And of course, Trump's hotels profited as they'd have World Summit meetings there and trying to deal with the pandemic or with social issues and everything else that he needed to have in his hotels, of course. So did Gavin Newsom and his wineries and shipping his products. And he still managed to attend high-level fundraisers and events with his scandal at the French lingerie place, which was not a lingerie store. What about the Republicans? Well, they were also controlling the stimulus and rescue plans to cause the shortages because they benefited from these riots, right? They used the riots to spread COVID, like I said. Tear gas sprayed on these rioters caused more coughing and face rubbing and spreading of the virus itself too. So by inciting incidents that caused Black Lives Matter to assemble and Antifa to create riots and organize Occupy movements, spread the virus. They spread, help Big Pharma, of course, and their campaign donors, right? So definitely if they were doing this type of activity or inciting this type of activity, conservatives gained campaign contributions, and Big Pharma could benefit because Trump could order the vaccines out and spending on their industry. And they could inflame their own base with rhetoric of workers versus welfare recipients, which played into the racism, the movements against Black Lives Matter and against folks that had time to be out there for Antifa, and pit the business owners and people that had higher incomes, job creators, yes, against those that were employees or laid off. And the fossil fuel industry loved this because the Democrats would be forced to compromise and spend the money on welfare and transfer payments, the stimulus checks, versus more investment into alternative energy they could have been doing if there was not a coronavirus. That would have been their typical plan of action anyway. So fossil fuels are going to benefit by staying in control, and Russia benefits because that's their major export. Look at the score jump now. Republicans have taken the lead again, and they're running away with it. And they're going to force the Democratic governors to use the National Guard to control the riots and come out there and police their states, maybe enforce mask mandates and the problems created by spreading the virus. And Trump can declare them incompetent and maybe take full control over National Guard use and therefore enscone himself in power. This was always a threat that I think that liberals and activists feared in Trump taking over. They monitored young people too with online gaming and all those Facebook apps, the face recognition requests, the type that could put your face in the movies and do alternate photographs with Snapchat, these game apps that you saved the girl from the shark or something like that, and you got away with the treasure. And even the free use of Pornhub was collecting people's IP servers and opening them up to being called by those contacts that wanted to renew their vehicle warranty before it expired. I think they were getting the data off of Facebook and everybody that had put their number in for their password recoveries. We haven't been able to trust the app and a few others like Google, those that collect metadata, for a long time. And of course, that type of stuff would be useful in blackmail. The right did not care if the religious and the pro-life agenda and others would die from church gatherings and spreading of the coronavirus at super spreader events and that type of thing once they had their votes and they were cemented in power again. It was really temporary and something after this election. I mean, why have the coronavirus appear in an election year? What are the chances? Well, 25%, right? Because we have a presidential election every 4 years. But at this point, 2020, it was just highly suspicious. It makes you really scratch your head. And the Democrats can use all the information and the death of the religious right, if they really did succumb to coronavirus, if they weren't vaxxed and chose to pray to God for salvation. would help the Democrats win another election later on, but not in 2020. Compromat is something originally established by Russia, I had mentioned, and the Chinese use Swalwell and more. The extent's not all discovered yet, and some of it predates COVID, for how Chinese agents used American politicians and gained access from some of the Hunter Biden scandal stuff that happened. I'm sure it was true. There are no innocent people in this game. So the Trump legacy is what we're covering now. Trump's legacy is really interesting here. One thing that they are doing is they're definitely accusing the Democrats, their opposition, of exactly what they are guilty of. You can even see that being a Russian play, as Russia might have even just destroyed one of their own oil refineries and blamed Ukraine on the attack. This is ridiculous, but it's just something that was an old KGB spy op type thing that you'd see in designing fake news so that it was real news. But this could be designed for Trump to have won in 2020, or also possibly to win in 2024. A really outrageous radical idea I had was that Biden could be willingly part of this whole plan, and what they needed was for Biden to be in office now, so it looks balanced. It doesn't look like it's been altered and skewed, and Trump gets a ready-made following to help him out. But the Bidens got rich, and so did the Clintons. You know that Hillary Clinton took out Gaddafi in Libya, and Hunter Biden was in Libya to look for a source of oil, and of course his family would be in on the profiting from that. But in looking at what wasn't all a bad action, working into the Middle East with the coronavirus at our backs, devastated ISIS. You didn't hear too much about them during this whole crisis. They're only now reasserting themselves, conveniently when Biden's in office after Trump is out. And that could also be, definitely a CIA operation, as Bin Laden in Al-Qaeda, which was formerly the Mujahideen, and Saddam Hussein's regime were both CIA propped up. But the virus could have almost gotten rid of Eun Jung Kim in North Korea, leaving his sister to take over, as she would be next in line over there in their secession. But that didn't happen. But he did get really sick and disappeared for several weeks. But when the Chinese pulled out of Iran, or Iran kicked them out basically because of fears of spreading the virus, Russia could come in and help Iran with their oil market and be a source of income for Russians at the same time they were kicking out the Chinese. Because Russia is really competing with the Chinese. Big oil would benefit because they don't have to deal with ISIS, and they didn't have to mess around with a lot of terrorism in the Middle East during this time when everybody was locked down and afraid. And of course, we know Russia and oil are joined at the hip. Fossil fuel industry profits again. So, meanwhile, with these stimulus checks, everybody's buying votes, and it's working in the benefit of whatever party's in power. They gerrymander their districts, and Republicans and conservatives have their safe districts, as do liberals and Democrats. Buying Republicans wins for the Russians, buying Chinese wins for the Democrats. We've seen how they're tied hand in hand. Big oil, the drug cartels, and big pharma all had wins from this. Maybe some in less degree than the big ones. As you can see that the political players, the national players, had almost twice as many reasons as big oil, the drug cartels, and big pharma. Meanwhile, voting by mail was a draw. I think that the Democrats knew that they would counter Republicans trying to shut down polling locations and places where people could mail in their votes or even mail in vote efforts. by having a greater mail-in vote effort, and the Democrats sent ballots to everybody whether they requested them or not. And it was a good counter move, basically ending up in a draw. That didn't go anywhere, but both sides tried to make their plays, and it's really disheartening, disappointing if you believe in having a democratic process and everybody having a vote in our society. It's totally un-American to restrict that. I was not very fond of the idea. Being a patriot, a real patriot, I think people should be able to vote. I don't think it's patriotic to try to conserve capitalism over democracy in itself. So we've come up with the final totals, and the conservatives ended up with the most points, and they therefore could have had the most reasons for releasing the coronavirus. Wow, right? Were you expecting that one? And we take a look now back at to see who had the best reasons, but I'm going to leave that up for you to decide.
So the Republicans really took the high score here. Did they have the motivation to actually steal the election? They certainly accused the other side of doing what they might have done themselves. And Republican Intelligence Committee actually saw the problem that there was Russian interference in the election. And now Vladimir Putin's in Ukraine. See the connections?
So real quickly in review, I want to look at our winners and the conservatives, the liberals, the Russians, and Chinese, and see who really put out the coronavirus and whether you think they had the best reasons. What I want to skip through here is to see where they're different. And basically, do you want to have only white people, English speakers of your background around you and your community? How far are you willing to go to engineer that? And are you against abortion? Were you wanting wins in political office to coincide with your faith-based opinion, or is your opinion anti-abortion for some other reason? And I showed you that there were a lot more, actually, to that movement for causes for customers and economic growth. Of course, Wall Street versus Main Street. I don't know how, unless if you're a big corporate CEO, you're favoring a lot of people being out of work. But it was destroying economics of organized crime and taking cash transactions out of the picture, and a lot of people getting stimulus checks on credit cards issued and that sort of thing. Gun sales were accelerated. They weren't discounted, though. So any of us that wanted to get a new piece each actually paid a higher price. But we have parents that want to control what their young people learn. And that played a part. So do you think that the Republicans, the Democrats, or foreign players actually had the best reasons for doing this? Most importantly, on the liberals' list were universal health care, paid sick leave, a moratorium on evictions, rent and loan deferrals, housing the homeless, and the general left's agenda. The Republicans got a lot of rioters and protesters on their own side, and people mistrusting the educated and science and going into what the pundits believed and buying into fake news, catering to the religious right, they assembled an army of people to protest and support Trump and believe that the election was stolen somehow, eventually leading to the January 6th riot. That's just a matter of record. And the Republicans made moves to save states' rights based on social issues so their politicians could have their own fiefdoms. They wanted to increase the American birth rate and therefore increase Social Security solvency, because retirees are the most conservative group and they're dependent on fixed income, Social Security, and their fear of the economic situation becoming unstable in their waning golden years motivates their votes. They achieved this to great effect by inflaming their base with a workers versus welfare recipients rhetoric. And they made the Democrats compromise on investing in alternative energies to support the oil industries, instead by having the Democrats divert funds that they desperately needed to keep up unemployment insurance and welfare running so that people wouldn't just starve to death, and be able to stamp out the virus by getting the medical needs that they saw it taken care of. And there you have the final number, all the reasons that the coronavirus might have been released. It does certainly look like it's skewed a certain way, and a certain group was motivated the most to do this in an election year. And the list of reasons for doing so might have produced winners in some areas, but we all lost. And I hope that you'll be able to express your opinions in the comments. But the idea of having released the coronavirus on purpose globally to affect a huge population of the entire world by unelected individuals enacting decisions not voted on is just anathemic. And it's totally disgusting. I don't think that we could ever see something, except maybe nuclear proliferation resulting in war, that would be an equivalent of a bioengineered virus pandemic that changed the world forever. I hope this helped take the mask off of it.
So I hope we'll discover the truth, and you'll find your truth. Thank you for watching. If you like the contents of this video, please give it a thumbs up. Buried Values books can be found on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold. Like new content on Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook, and see things you've never seen before. Thank you for having an open mind and thinking about it too. What have we just lived through? Let's find out the truth. For the truth has value. Class is just an act.